The Gallup poll conducted last year found roughly 3 in 10 adults in the U.S. regularly attended religious services, down from more than 40% just 2 decades ago. According to the poll, church attendance is likely to keep dropping because younger Americans having a weaker attachment to religions. And according to a 2024 Pew study, 8 in 10 Americans say religion is losing influence in public life. Let's bring in right now opinion columnist for the New York Times, Ross Douthat. Ross is the author of the new book titled Believe: Why Everyone Should Be Religious. Ross, thank you so much for being with us. We sit on the show, and I know you write columns and other people write columns, and we look at all the problems that are facing not only this society, but also more particularly our children. And I just don't think it's a coincidence that over the past 20, 30 years, as church pews have emptied out, synagogue pews have emptied out, that America's become more materialistic. It's become more secular, and at the same time, more depressed and more isolated. Talk about the importance of faith in people's lives and why it helps solve so many of these social ills that we're facing today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Joe. I think the story you tell is about right, that basically the story of the last 20 years in America is a story of people falling away from organized religion, disaffiliating from churches, often for reasons connected to scandal, the sex abuse scandal in my own Catholic church, scandals in other churches as well, and also a sense of kind of political identities becoming more important than religious identities, like politics taking the place of religion. So one of the statistics I like to cite is 60 or 70 years ago, people would have been more likely to say that they were worried if their daughter or son married someone of a different religion than a different political party. And now it's the opposite. People are less concerned if you marry outside your religion, but if you marry a Democrat or a Republican and your parent is the opposite party, people get upset. And I think that speaks to the way that politics has become a kind of primary attachment in our national life, and religion a secondary one. And what that does, and you mentioned kids, right? Kids in America, this is the first generation really raised in large numbers, not just without like strong religious attendance or practice, but without any kind of direct connection to organized religion. And I don't think it's a coincidence that out of that you get a generation that is more anxious, more depressed, and more worried, I think in this fundamental way about like, what is a human being's place in the universe? What is like my metaphysical horizon? What is the point of life? Which are questions that religion is in fact there to answer.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about politics and religion, and again, how they've blurred, and how politics seem to become more important than religion. And it reminds me of Jesus saying, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, unto God that which is God. It seems, again, so much of that has blurred or been changed. And Tim Keller, a guy whose church services I would always go to in Manhattan, Tim, before he passed, said he stopped using the term evangelical because he was an evangelical. But he said, when I use the term, it's now been overrun by politics. So I don't even call myself an evangelical anymore. How did this happen?
Well, part of that is, it is this sense of political polarization where as religion declines, it becomes more associated with the more conservative parts of America. And so then people in more liberal parts of America don't want to identify with, let's say, evangelical Christianity or Christianity in general, because they see themselves as identifying with George W. Bush or Sarah Palin or, and people they disagree with. And then that sort of furthers the cycle where then liberalism becomes more secular and people who are liberal feel they have less in common with religious believers who are more conservative, and it's sort of a cycle that feeds on itself. I do think, though, I want to say something more optimistic here. The statistics you cited at the beginning are all true. Religion has been in decline, sort of generationally. I think if you look at the last few years, though, the number of Americans who say they have no religious affiliation has actually leveled off. It's stopped rising, right? And there are a lot of indicators, I think, that people are interested in sort of spiritual questions in a new way. These things tend to go in cycles, and some of this is expressed in interest in organized religion, traditional forms of faith. Some of it's expressed in, a kind of 1970s style, we're going to take psychedelics and, do our horoscopes and get in touch with the mysteries of the universe. And part of the argument I'm making in the book is, in fact, that it's probably a better idea to take a second look at the organized and traditional religions than to just go out spiritually freelancing. But both of those, I think, are things that are happening a bit more in the last 5 years than was the case in 2017 or 2013. So I think it's a slightly more optimistic moment for religion in America right now.
On that point, Ross, I find a lot of people that are more religious than they are church-going. And I think that you have people that make a distinction between being spiritual and being religious. And in some communities, particularly the black communities, churches play more than a religious role. They were the social structure that our politics and our historic black colleges came out of. As you see where we are now with the polarization, do you think the polarization politically and socially will energize people more toward church going and not just freelance spiritual searching? Because the danger of that is that if you're not anchored anywhere, where do you ever arrive?
Right. I mean, I think there's a lot of the freelancing and a lot of people in this moment getting freaked out about what's happening in politics and sort of doubling down on political identity. But for exactly the reasons you described, I think it's actually much better for people who are sort of loosely attached to religion, who have, a desire for a spiritual connection and so on, to reconnect to an actual institution, right? And there are a lot of, I'm more of a conservative Christian, right? I have a lot of liberal-leaning friends who tend to be sort of nostalgic for the days when liberal Protestant churches, for instance, played a big role in American life. Those churches are all still there. Not all of them, a few have closed, right? But you can go to those churches on Sunday morning. If you're a liberal who feels sort of spiritually adrift and looking for answers in life, you don't have to go full Latin Mass Catholicism. If you want to, get in touch with me, we can talk, right? But there are a lot of houses of worship open right now, today. Maybe not today, Sunday morning, right? Where you can go and have a connection with the ultimate questions about the universe without committing yourself to the full panoply of conservative doctrines. We'll talk about those later.
And I'll tell you what, I'm going to leave you with a full-blown Latin Mass, and I'll stay in the Baptist church. But, there's something that you wrote about, and it's something that I've seen in my life. I grew up in the church, and it was the center of our life, our family's life. And I've had people my whole life say to me what you said, some people said to you when you were writing this book, which was, I wish I could have faith. It seems like a beautiful thing that you have. I wish I could believe. And I'm just curious, what was your response to them, and what's your response to those who say, I think what you're doing is beautiful. I love watching people going to church. I even sometimes go and I'll sit in the back of a church and just watch it myself, but I can't get there. What was your message to them when they told you that?
So two things, right? I mean, the first is that ultimately, religious faith is about a relationship with God, and in the Christian tradition, it's about God's grace reaching out to individuals. And in that sense, obviously, you can't just sort of will yourself or think yourself into, full-scale Christian communion. However, I think a lot of people in our society make it a lot harder than it should be to take the first step toward religion. They say, oh, if I become religious, I'm leaving behind science and rationality and all of modern civilization. And a big part of the argument I make in the first part of the book especially is that that's just really not true. That if you look deep into everything from what physics has revealed about the order and structure and the design of the universe, to what we know about modern consciousness, to just the persistence of very strange supernatural experiences, there are a lot of good reasons why you shouldn't feel like you're abandoning anything to do with reason or seriousness when you take a next step into religion. And in fact, it's what a serious person ought to do.
Ross, I lost my grandmother last year. She was nearly 98 years old. She was a devout Christian. I also am a devout Christian. And I guess, what she used to say to me is the best way to show that the Christian church is open to others is to live those values. And I don't see a lot of that in America today. So I guess I wonder, the question to you is, what should Christians who do go to church, and I specifically mean Christians who are church going, what do they need to do? What kind of reflection should they be engaged in, given the fact that so many Americans have said, I reject these institutions? And that's not just political, because a lot of the things that drive politics, that drive people to certain political parties, are deeply held values.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I'd say first, people should keep in mind, that a lot of what we think about in terms of religion does get refracted through our media, and I'm part of the media. This is not an anti-media statement, But the media is much more comfortable talking about politics than talking about religion, And so there is a kind of media narrative around religion where everything that a prominent pastor or bishop or priest or ordinary believer does that's in any way political gets highlighted. And the ordinary life of religion in America, the soup kitchen, Sunday church service, family life, and so on, doesn't get that kind of coverage. So one thing I would say is being religious, if you're looking at it from the outside, it's not just sitting around having high-level arguments about same-sex marriage and immigration policy, That isn't actually what you get if you join a normal religious body or Christian church. Then for the Christians themselves, I think this is advice that goes beyond Christianity. I'm a conservative columnist who writes for the New York Times, which has a slightly more liberal than conservative readership, And one thing that's really useful in talking to people who disagree with you and writing for people who disagree with you is just trying to find ways to like them, to like people. Jesus asks us to love our enemies. I think a good first step in that direction is figuring out, what do you like about people who disagree with you, What's a first step towards showing the deepest Christian love that you can take in ordinary life? And I think that then feeds into ideas of how welcoming is your religious community when someone comes in who doesn't agree with you about everything and is interested and wants to join, But just at a basic level, I'm very pro-human being. Human beings, in fact, even Elon Musk and Donald Trump, for the MSNBC audience, are really interesting and fascinating characters, even if you think they're doing terrible things to America in the moment. And the same is true of people on the other side of the aisle. And I think, in an odd way, having a greater appreciation for the human person is a good way to take a step closer to having the correct ideas about Almighty God Himself.
Thanks.
And on taking that first step to faith, also, you don't have to give up science, you don't have to give up reason, and you also don't have to be perfect. It is a faith of sinners, and I prove that every day, and so do every other Christian. We could talk about Peter for a very long time, St. Peter, but
he made some early mistakes.
He made some big mistakes. He denied Jesus 3 times. And what did Jesus do? You are Peter. I'm going to build my church upon you.
Yeah, that's right.
Very Catholic thing to say, Joe, I have to say.
That is the rock, Petra,
Baptist thing.
exactly.
I know.
It's a Baptist thing.
Yeah, no, but I'm just saying, for all those that are holding back and not taking the first step, like Jesus picked the guy around him that was the most sort of overmatched by the challenges of life, and said, "I'm going to build my church on you." Anyway, the new book, Believe: Why Everyone Should Be Religious, is now on sale. Ross, thank you so much for being with us. We greatly appreciate it, and we're going to take a look coming up next.